Today, we're diving into a fascinating case from the Philippine Supreme Court. It all starts with a ship's cook and what seems like a simple request. But this story, it spirals into a major legal showdown that asks a really important question about your rights at work.
And really, this entire case, this whole explainer, it all boils down to this one question. Can your boss fire you for saying no to something that isn't actually your job? The court's answer is crystal clear, so let's get into the details.
All right, first up, let's lay out the facts of the case. It all starts with our complainant, a guy whose only job was to cook.
So, meet Cristanico Legahi. Back in 1992, he signs a 10-month contract to be the chief cook on a ship called the MV Federal Nord. Seems pretty straightforward, right? A standard contract for a very standard job. He's there to prepare the food, period.
But pretty soon after they set sail, the shipmaster hits him with a really strange order. He wants Legahi to prepare something called the victualling cost statement. Now, this had nothing to do with chopping vegetables or grilling fish. This was all paperwork, calculating food costs, tracking inventory, accounting stuff. Legahi knew right away this was way outside the duties of a chief cook.
So even though he knew it wasn't his job, Legahi went along with it. The first time he was basically told, hey, don't worry, just copy the old ones. So he did. He did it in November, did it again in December, and then again in January. You can imagine he probably did it just because he didn't want to make waves or get his boss angry.
But this pattern of just going along with it, well, it was about to come to a screeching halt. And this one confrontation would end up costing him his job. So on January 6th, things totally blew up. The shipmaster comes to Legahi and demands that he correct the statement he'd just done. But Legahi was right in the middle of his actual job, cooking, so he just asked if he could do it later. A pretty reasonable request, you'd think. But oh no, that was seen as outright defiance. And this right here is the smoking gun. This is a direct quote from the ship's logbook. On that exact same day, January 6th, the captain wrote that since Legahi refused an order, he was getting sent home. Done deal. The decision to fire him was already made. You got to remember that detail. It's going to be super important later. Now, just look at how fast this all happened. A week after the captain secretly decides to fire him, another accusation suddenly pops up. Then, the very next morning, they hold this supposed hearing, and by lunchtime that same day, Legahi is already off the ship and on a plane home. I mean, wow, that is unbelievably fast.
Of course, Legahi files a complaint for illegal dismissal. And this brings us right to the main issue the Supreme Court had to decide. Was his firing actually legal? And to figure that out, the court uses this standard, two-part test. You can kind of think of the court here like a referee checking the rule book. For any firing to be considered legit in the Philippines, the employer has to prove they followed two completely separate but equally critical rules. And those two rules are, first, just cause, meaning did they have a real, valid, legal reason to fire the person? And second, due process, meaning was the process itself fair? Did they follow the proper procedure? For a firing to stick, an employer has to check both of those boxes.
And due process isn't just some vague idea. It's a very specific three-step procedure. You get a written notice telling you what you're accused of. Then you get a real chance to explain yourself and defend your case. And finally, you get a second written notice telling you the final decision. So, now for the court's ruling. Let's see how the facts of what happened to Legahi actually measure up against these two big tests of just cause and due process.
Okay, so first the court looked at the process. The law clearly says 2 notices and a reasonable chance to respond. And what did Legahi get? A single meeting where they read some charges at him and then fired him, all in less than 2 hours. I mean, the gap between what's required and what happened is just massive.
So, the court's verdict on due process was simple. They failed. Big time. That so-called hearing on January 14th was a total sham, a complete formality. Why? Because that logbook entry proved the company had already decided to fire him 8 days earlier. Okay, so the process was totally flawed. But what about the reason itself? This is the other half of the puzzle. Did Legahi's actions actually count as willful disobedience, which would be a just cause for getting fired?
And this is where we get to the ratio decidendi. That's just the fancy legal term for the core reasoning behind the court's final decision. The court looked at the facts and said, wait a minute, the captain's order wasn't even valid to begin with. Preparing that statement was not in Legahi's contract. The form itself didn't even have a spot for a cook to sign. And most importantly, his request to just do it later wasn't some wrongful and perverse attitude. It was just a reasonable request.
And so the ruling on that second test was also a resounding fail. There was no just cause here. The order itself was unreasonable because it had absolutely nothing to do with the job he was hired to perform.
So that brings us to the final disposition, which is just what the court decided to do about it. They completely threw out the lower labor commission's decision. They ordered the company to pay Legahi his full salary for the rest of his contract, all 7 months, plus attorney's fees.
So, okay, that's great for Legahi, but what's the big lesson here for the rest of us? What's the key doctrine or principle we should all take away from this story?
Well, the court established a really clear legal principle here, a core doctrine, and it's this. For an employer to fire you for willful disobedience, the order you supposedly disobeyed has to meet a few conditions. It has to be reasonable, lawful, you have to know about it, and, this is the big one, it has to be directly related to the duties you are actually hired to do.
So look, if you remember just one thing from all of this, let it be this. For a firing to be legal, an employer needs both a valid reason and a fair process. You can't have one without the other. A great reason doesn't save you if the process was a sham, and a perfect process doesn't matter if there was no valid reason to begin with. You have to have both.
Which really leaves us all with a final question to think about. The story of Kristenico Legahi is this powerful reminder about why knowing the rules matters so much. So, how confident are you that you know your rights and your responsibilities in your own workplace?